Good afternoon, comrades. This is Tal. We're continuing looking at the life and brilliance of Mikhail Tal. We're starting with his younger games and moving on up so we can see sort of his natural development progression through the years. This is another game from his younger years. This was a student's blitz tournament, so not the most serious format, but still a very brilliant game. This is Janusz Szukszta, I think. Janusz Szukszta. We'll go with that. Gets Mikhail Tal. Tal is black here. d4, knight f6, c4, g6. Just like the modern Benoni, the King's Indian was perfectly tailored to Tal's aggression. The King's Indian really came into being in the 40s with players like Bronstein and Boleslavsky. But Mikhail Tal in the 50s and 60s also helped its progression quite a bit. Some with theoretical work, but mostly just through his practice. For millions of people, seeing the King's Indian be played in a World Championship match and demolishing Botvinnik and demolishing the greatest Soviet players at the highest level really did a lot for the opening. So this fits Tal like a glove as well. Bishop 5, d6, f3. So this is called the Samish. There are many perfectly adequate ways to face the King's Indian, and this is just one of them. So the pluses are, it supports the e4 pawn, so black is very unlikely to engineer any sort of successful attack against the e4 pawn. The f3 pawn supports a general kingside push, so white can think about moves like g4, just a general storm on the kingside. Also, the g4 square isn't available to either the black's knight or bishop, so if white plays bishop e3, he doesn't have to worry about knight g4 as a response. That's already been cut out from the position. Excuse me. So those are the upsides. What are the downsides? That's another pawn on light squares. So when you look at all these pawns, g2, f3, e4, c4, those are all on light squares. That means white's control of the dark squares have been naturally diminished. So a lot of times in the Samish variation, black is able to engineer very successful play on the dark squares, simply because white has placed so many of his pawns on light squares. There's also this internal weakness on e3. To clarify what that phrase means, there's such a thing as weak pawns, but there's also such a thing as weak squares, and those can often be exploited once the pawn cover goes away. So the square of e3, it can't be occupied now by black now, obviously, but once that pawn cover goes away, that could be an internal weakness that black's able to take advantage of, especially with his strong King's Indian bishop. And we do see it in this game as a bit of foreshadowing. So the Samish often turns into white's natural aggression on the king side versus black trying to immediately get play in the center via the dark squares. And that really informs a lot of the opening theory that happens here. Perfectly adequate line for both sides. Castle. Bishop e3 is the main theoretical move. I think white's moved on past that a little bit, mostly because of one specific theoretical line. When I played d4 exclusively, the line I played against the King's Indian and the Samish, bishop g5, the main consequence, it avoids e5, so it cuts out a lot of theory. So c5 is one of the main moves. e5 is flat out losing. And then the knight simply takes on c7 with a winning game. So c5 is one of the main moves. And this is sort of a new Benoni structure, in contrast to the f4 lines that we saw in the previous game from Tal. The pawn's on f3, so white has a very solid central presence. White's not really going to be pushing for e5, but he is going to be pushing for a general kingside push eventually. That or maneuver his pieces around and try to strangle black slowly. The bishop on g5 is actually quite well placed here. It pins this knight on f6 very nicely. But bishop e3 was played. This was the main move back then, and it's still perfectly fine. e5, this is the old-fashioned way. It's still perfectly fine, but the new and modern way, and this is the move that's sort of discouraged, bishop e3, a little bit c5. This is a modern pawn sacrifice that has developed quite a bit of theory. So white can play d5 and go for the same Benoni structure. The bishop on e3 is a little bit worse placed, though, so this isn't as advisable here. Knight g2 is another good way to dodge the pawn sacrifice if white accepts. 6, bishop a3. And this is just one of many lines in this modern variation, but black has at least enough compensation. White's up a pawn, and with the queens off the board, it seems like a very strange concept to have a decisive attack or something like that for the pawn, but black's compensation is strictly positional. Again, these dark squares in the center are completely emaciated, so black is always able to occupy these with either a knight or a bishop. This bishop on a3 is especially shameful also. It's just completely shut out from the game, and it's unable to help the fight for these dark squares in the center. And that was a consequence of playing bishop a3 in response to b6, but that was forced, because of knight b4. That's just one of many lines. I didn't want to turn this into a theoretical treatise. But c5 has really put a spanner in the works for white playing bishop e3 in this line. But e5 is sort of the old-fashioned way. Knight g2, this is fine. It's not super-duper critical. d5 is the critical test, just gobbling up space on offer. There are a lot of lines from here, so again, this is just a very brief sketch of a little bit of the theory. This is the King's Indian, so properly detailing the theory of even this line would take hours upon hours. But the most fun line, because chess should be fun, Queen h4. This isn't exactly the position of Bronstein's idea, but this is quite similar. Knight xg3, so this leads to some forced pawn. Knight b6. And this is a very fun position. I don't think it's good for black. I think white is objectively better here. But I think this is the sort of position where the objective evaluation should mostly bow to the subjective playability. This is objectively better for white, but I think it's much more playable for black. This is a difficult position to play as white, because this queen, it can't be everywhere at once, whereas black has 2 bishops and 2 pawns for the queen. And black can start to push on both sides of the boards at once. Black can get f5 in and push on the king side, and black can also play something like c6, press in the center. Black can also play a5, a4, push on the queen side. He can do all of those at the same time. And it's difficult for the queen to dance around all at once. I think objectively, white is better, and maybe even much better. But subjectively, I think this is a lot more fun for black. And since we are human beings playing other human beings, I think the subjective playability should sometimes bow to the objective evaluation. So, a very interesting idea. Of course, Bronstein was sort of the king of interesting ideas, and he littered the King's Indian with a lot of his brilliancies. So give that a look if you're looking for something interesting. But knight g2 was played. c6, this is bad. exd4 is simply a better move order. And then this is just a normal King's Indian sort of Marachi structure. Queen b3 was played. This is simply showing the strength of Janusz. This is not a terribly good move. d5 is just the normal King's Indian move. c6. And this is a fairly normal position. Just like most King's Indian positions, the engine absolutely hates black's position, but black scores pretty normally from here. Of course, the queen doesn't make any sense at all on b3. It's just completely misplaced. And as the main fight in this opening variation is the central dark squares for white, especially the square d4, that's taking that queen away from the main battlefield. And then an incendiary move, d5. So I'd like to compare the older coverage that I saw in books when I was growing up to the objective coverage that I was able to generate, or as objective as I can manage, through actually looking at the position with an engine and a database and all that. In books growing up, again, you had a lot of nonsensical talk about Tal the hypnotist, and how he would simply play unsound moves intentionally to bamboozle his opponents. This is one of those. In some of the older books, you can say that you can see it claim that this was an unsound move and that Tal just got away with some mischief. complete nonsense. This is a completely justified move. It's not winning, but it's an entirely logical. Look at the king on e1. It's stuck in the center. Look at our king on g8. It's safely castled. That should be the flashing red light to open the center. It's an absolutely logical move. Now, it's not winning for black. It's not black's only move. Black could play something more King's Indian-y, like rook e8, and then followed by knight bd7, b5. That would be a normal King's Indian game. But d5 is eminently logical here. So white takes, and white immediately collapses. Again, I don't think that's wamboozling. I don't think that's hypnotism. As I've said many times in these sessions, it is much easier to attack than defend. And human beings, when they're under pressure, there are some human beings that react well to pressure. They sort of buckle down and play their best. But on average, most human beings, when they're under pressure, they don't play to their full capacity. So if you in your own games, you play aggressive chess, you play attacking chess, and you put maximum pressure, by and large, you're going to get your opponents to play under their capacities. Now, that's not an injunction to intentionally play unsound chess to generate that pressure, because that's not what Tal was doing here. Again, d5 is a completely logical move, and at worst, black is well within the drawing zone with an interesting position. But at best, that pressure immediately generates a mistake, and that's exactly what happens here. That completely opens up the avenue to white's king, and especially that internal weakness on e3 is glaring now. If that pawn were still on f2, this would be completely losing for black, because that bishop on e3 would be a reliable barricade for the white king. But because we chose the samest variation, that f3 move, that internal weakness in e3 is a big deal now. White should have just castled. And this following line is pretty much forced. Knight f5, so beautiful move. Black's forced to take this. Take. And this is more or less dynamic equality. It's maybe a little bit better for white, but this is still well within the drawing zone. Practically, I would take black here. Black has, right now, 2 pawns, a knight and a rook for the queen. The king on c1 is far more exposed than the king on g8. White will corral this pawn on f3, but it'll take time, and that'll give black time to finish his mobilization. Subjectively, I absolutely prefer black, even if objectively white might be a little better with correct play, but we're human beings playing against other human beings. So the Tal hypnotism, this playing of unsound, aggressive moves, it's just leading to positions that are still well within the drawing zone. This myth of Tal being a magician and a wamboozler only developed because the players at the time just didn't understand his play. He was a generation ahead of his peers in terms of handling dynamic play. He sort of instinctively understood the energy in all of his pieces and the dynamics available in the position. And they just weren't able to figure out a way to defend. They were just blown away, so they had to invent a reason for it beyond their own poor play, because people are bad at admitting that. But EX d5 just completely losing. Rook e8, eminently logical, just aim at the king. King f2. Knight c6. This is the prettier version. Black can also switch up the move order, but knight c6 is fine. dx, and then beautiful. And that's the original sin of that f3 move coming back to haunt white. That internal weakness on e3 is now glaring. Rook d1, this is collapsing, but white's already lost. The main line here, king x c3, x d4. So, black is down a rook, but black has a decisive initiative for the rook. Queen e5, bishop f5 is bad. Material's temporarily equal, but white's assumed the initiative. But queen e5 keeps it going. And white's up a full exchange here. I think I misstated that. He's not down a rook, he's down an exchange. But this initiative against the white king is completely decisive. But rook d1 just completely collapses. It doesn't even make black prove his position. So knight g4, unleashing the King's Indian bishop. In these variations where we take on d4, that King's Indian bishop is often so key to the position. bishop x d4, so line up against the white king. Queen d5, trying to get the queens off the board, but Tao responds very beautifully. Rook e2. That is an absolutely gorgeous move, and that's the sort of move that you remember. It very much reminds me of some of the moves more if you played against the Count and Duke in their opera game, which we went over in a video earlier in the channel's history. But absolutely gorgeous move. Just a pure clear and sacrifice to bring the rest of his piece in with tempo. So the king takes his force, bishop x g4 check, so the bishop comes in with tempo, and then the rook comes in with tempo. Rook x e2. This is forced, and then this is completely losing. Just absolutely beautiful game from Tao. And again, there's a lot of nonsense that's written about Mikhail Tao. I remember in older books that d5 is an example of the hypnotic, shambolic play that he would bust out to induce errors from his poor opponents. Nothing could be further from the truth. This is a completely logical move. The white king is stuck in the center. Our king is safely barricaded behind that fianchetto wall. Open up the center. Go after the white king. And again, I'll slam on this over and over. Aggressive play reaps benefits. And I don't even necessarily mean aggressive play and you have to be sacrificing rooks or knights constantly. Just finding ways to put pressure on your opponent. Playing actively will almost always reap dividends and reap benefits. Playing passively will almost always not work out well because it's so much easier to attack than defend, and it's hard for human beings to operate their best under pressure. If you play aggressively, play actively, and put your opponent under pressure, you reap benefits. And it's not any sort of hypnotism, it's just the way we are as human beings. And the way Tao just absolutely bombarded him after one mistake, more or less. Just absolutely beautiful. And that rook e2 move is just absolutely gorgeous. So, beautiful game from Tao. We're going to continue looking at his early fireworks next session. So my name is John. I'll see you then.